Neurologically, we know today that even people with weaker intellectual ability, lower IQs, who have, even people who have a hard time focusing, even if they have brilliant IQs, ADHD, diagnosed ADHD, when it comes to something that they're interested in, when it comes to something that excites them, neurologically, we see in the neurocircuitry that the dopamine which is the pursuit of pleasure, the pursuit of something that is desirable and enjoyable, begins to be activated. That allows for an increased focus, the equivalence of what other medication, what people may take, like Adderall.
All right, welcome to the podcast, the Anything Torah podcast. We are here with Rabbi Yekusiel Kalmenson. Thanks for joining. We know this is
Pleasure to be here.
Making for a while. We're happy to have you.
Yes, thank you.
So let me first discuss what the point of this podcast. We haven't done too many yet, but just to get an idea, and then we could go into, hopefully maybe you could help us with it. Basically, the goal of the podcast is to bring the audience's sense of belonging and longing for a precious tradition that we call the Torah here in the year 2025, to show how personal of an experience it should and can be, and to discuss how, being that we have so much access to information, it can be pretty overwhelming for people in their day-to-day lives to zero in on something they could connect to. But at the same time, being that we have access to so much, it can at the same time be easy with the right guidance. So with that in mind, that is the goal of this podcast, to try to bring as many people as possible that can hopefully inspire people and just show them, on a practical level, how us people connect in every kind of scenario and lifestyle. So that being said, the question over here would be to yourself, if you would like to introduce yourself and possibly give us some background in regards to your family in Torah and yourself as well. And then I'll get more into specifics afterwards, if you would like.
For sure. So it's a pleasure to be on here. And the objective and the goal are very noble, and it's inspiring to see this happening. A little bit about myself. So, Baruch Hashem, I had the opportunity to go through the entire yeshiva system as well as smicha, and then spend several years in a kollel, being able to learn full time, until after that I transitioned into the workforce, starting several behavioral health companies. But Hashem was fortunate enough to give me the opportunity to start a beautiful shul, which is sort of organic, early origins of it. It started off as a minyan in my living room, and one thing led to another. And Baruch Hashem, today we have a full base Medrash with big minyanim every day, Shachris, Mincha, Ma'ariv, Shiurim almost every single day. And so that is a very special part of my life as well. A little bit about my background. My father has a beautiful yeshiva in New Haven, Connecticut. He's Mechaber. He's the author of the Sfarim on Shas, Kavitz, Rishim, Shiurim. He has a twin brother who's the Rosh Yeshiva of Brunwa, who also is a Mechaber of over 20 Sfarim, called Meital, Afike Mayim. And so growing up, learning, having a passion for learning, feeling emotional satiation and a geschmack in learning was a very sort of natural thing that I was blessed to be surrounded by. And so I would say that throughout any part of my life, whatever episode or whatever sort of set of circumstances I would be finding myself in, I think it was always natural for Torah to always be a part of it in whatever way, shape, or form, just given to how second nature it was for me growing up. So that's a little bit of my background with Torah, Baruch Hashem. And I think that as I get older, it just becomes a more mature relationship, both in Kamos and Eichos. So maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later as well.
So just wanted to ask one specific thing. You mentioned that this was already part of your upbringing, and I'm sure it transitioned to some extent as you got older. Is there any specific things that you find that whether to a parent that you could maybe point to your upbringing, what you found that helped that Torah, that tradition created that as you got older, this was your go-to, this was your driving factor behind everything when you need to go back there.
I'll say two things. They say a story with the Ger Rebbe that there was a chassid who once came to the Ger Rebbe to tell him about how holy his child was. And he says, my little kid walks around the house with plate filling every morning, and he starts davening in his plate filling. What does the Rebbe think? And the Ger Rebbe responded, I think that his father should start davening with a minyan. So whatever a child sees at home, and this goes from when they're very, very young, but especially as they are, between 5 and 10 and their early teens, it makes an indelible impression. I think it was Rabbi Jonathan Sachs who once said, values aren't taught, they're caught. And it's hard to try to manipulate that. It's a very organic process. I met a Yid, a Hungarian Jew, who, even though he was a balabas, he still learns every morning, every evening. And he told me that he doesn't remember ever going to sleep when he was a child growing up. His father was a Holocaust survivor. He never remembers his father in bed. Whenever he went to bed, his father was at the dining room learning. Whenever he woke up, his father was already learning in the morning. So that's the first thing, that values aren't taught. They're caught, just being that dugma chaya. It sounds simplistic, but it's challenging, and it's very practical. It's very effective.
Mm-hmm.
Even if they rebel, there's another verse from the Ger Rebbe, these matters should be on your heart. It's a famous verb. Why on your heart? It should be in your heart. And he says, you can't put something in anyone's heart. All you can do is create the level of exposure and positive association that when the child's heart will open, it'll be right there waiting, and it will fall right in. And that's why you see so many people who may go this way and that way and be challenged in their Yiddishkeit and their connection and relationship to Torah. And sometimes it takes 30, 40, 50 years, but Saif Davar, they do come back when their parents did that. Just want to say one before I forget, one other point about how we give that to our children, how I received it. I would say that if somebody asks you about your father, what makes him happy? What is the biggest smile that you've ever seen him have? And what are the surrounding circumstances around that smile? And that has to do with Kedusha and Limud Torah. Then subliminally, that imparts and imbues to the child that this is something gishmak, this is something enjoyable, and this is something worth working hard for. So that's the second nikuda.
Right. So yeah, I realize, because especially nowadays when there's so many distractions out of the home, even within the home, it seems that if parents aren't fully on top of everything in the house, the kids could really get lost in the message, just being that life is so busy nowadays. There's so much going on that, the environment is just seeping into the house more and more than it ever has been. So that's why people, nowadays are looking for, all these different kinds of tricks of the trade, if you will. Self-help books are very common now. People are just looking for different tools. I think just because they're getting lost, with all the distractions, which maybe I'll bring up soon in regards to your profession, right, which you're involved in right now. Maybe we'll get to that in a moment. But what I wanted to ask is, which has to do with really with the Gemara. It's a Gemara in a few places, in Brachas, Tainus, and Sanhedrin, in regards to the kind of study, the way the study used to be historically amongst the Jewish people, how people, even the regular laymen, the way they go, through their day after work, how they would focus on learning, because it's very hard to connect with everything and know everything. Even the most brilliant people out there, they all have their expertise in certain areas, especially when you're making this a lifestyle, it's really a journey for life. You're going to focus in specifically on things that you have a connection to, that you find more interesting for whatever reason. And I find that interesting because there's a Gemara where it sort of shows us historically how that might have been the case throughout many generations. The Gemara over there says, it's a Gemara in Brachis, there's a few other places. The Gemara discusses that Rav Papa asked Abaye, right? He says, why is it that the Rishonim, he's referring to the early generations, not clear exactly which ones, but that's for discussion on the side. He says, how come for them, miracles were quite common, but for us, it's not so common. So, and he, in part of that discussion, he brought up, he said, if it's because, of the study, right? He says, we seemingly study a lot more, right? He says, they only, focused in on one subject, whether it was the thing he was referring to was Nizikin, wherever that might be. He says, but we know whatever it is, the number, a lot more. So you see, even historically, that the way they studied was, over time, as time went on, more and more, they had access to much more information. And because of that, they knew a lot more, but not necessarily did they focus in, right, on one thing at a time, or, like you mentioned, that in certain generations, they focused in on just one thing at a time. They put a lot of their focus in. There's what to discuss about that Talmud, the Gemara, how to view it. But it definitely seems that there was a focus, a connection to specific subjects, which, as you get more information, it gets more hard to do that, especially now. Like you're talking about, 1,500 years ago, 1,300 years ago. Now we have access to like so much more information on the tips of our fingers. It becomes really overwhelming to many people, especially as you get older and you're not in yeshiva, you don't have as much time as you did during the yeshiva periods. And, you're working all day. You want to come home and actually, at the same time, you want to study, learn. You have a certain chiyuv, right, that you have to learn in the morning and the evening as a layman. But at the same time, you want to connect to it, right? You want this to be your passion. You want this to be your thing. So, and on top of that, I wanted to point out, actually, I could show you there's a Sefer Gilgulim, and I'm going to connect this to your profession specifically, that the Sefer Gilgulim writes, right, there's another Gemara, right, and there's a Talmud Maseches Shabbos that discusses how there were certain people that they were careful about certain mitzvahs as well, right? It's a famous Gemara, the wording is known, Avuch b'may havazor tfei, right? They asked, what was your father so careful about? The Sefer Gilgulim writes, so that's in regards to mitzvahs. He writes, actually, the same applies, this is the Arizal, in regards to limud Torah. Okay? And I'll read to you his wording. He says like this, and he interconnects it to the person's soul. He says, because every person, right, they have a certain tikkun. The Kabbalah believes in Gilgulim. That's something that's this concept of reincarnation of the soul. Every time the soul goes into another reincarnation, it has to fix something else up, to adjust something, to come to its fulfillment. And he says, in regards to mitzvahs, that's, there's something that you're going to have to zone in on. And there's going to be something in regards to learning as well. And I'll read to his learning. It's quite fascinating, his wording, rather. He says there are people who their hearts have a desire specifically in, he says, whether it's Pshata Torah, the simple understanding of the Torah. He says there are some that want to go into the Remez, the hints of the Torah, some go into Drush, some in Soid. He says it all has to do actually with the Gilgul of this person's, what's lacking in that stage of his Gilgul. And he says, therefore, the Arizal suggests, therefore, there's this concept that Talmud also discusses, that you should learn what your heart desires. So it's not just from a sense of, from the conscious sense of fulfillment, right? You want to feel connected to something. It's even literally from what your soul needs, from what your neshama needs. That Arizal seems to understand it as that what you desire is not because, it's not for no reason. There's actually a connected to your deeper parts of your soul, to your neshama, and therefore you should go after it. So I wanted to bring that up in connection to what you do, right? You specifically deal with, I understand, not fully, but to give us some background on that, mental health. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I'll before we jump into the mental health, just a couple of comments on the Sefer Gilgulim that you quoted, and in general to this idea. It's profoundly transformative when you unpack it. For starters, there's this Vasemis in this week's Parsha. I think it's very appropriate to bring up. He explains that the obsession between Mishpatim and Mishpatim having a divine origin, Af Elu Sinai, that even though they're rational and even though they're relatable, we still have to recognize and appreciate that ultimately the reason why we do them is because of the divine will and not because instinctively we don't want to steal and kill. He takes it a step further and he explains the foundation and essence of Mishpatim coming from Hashem is essentially exploring the very nature that we're wired with. Hagufa, why don't we want to kill? Hagufa, why don't we want to steal? Why don't we want to do all the things that would be a violation of Mishpatim? That nature was given to us because Hashem willed it, that our essence or our personality, our characteristics, our natural way of thinking should be aligned with his will, with the Mishpatim. So the very fact that we have that nature is only a result of Hashem wanting us to connect and resonate with the Mishpatim. So that's on a temperament, on a character level, on an emotional level. Intellectually, there's no question, what you said from the Sefer Shal that certain people, their neshamas connect and resonate with certain halakim of Torah. In fact, it's known that I think Al-Shech HaKadosh would fall asleep during the Rizal's shir, and it was bothering him a lot. I think it was the Al-Shech. And that is Tunis Chais. It was other that if it was either the Al-Shech or
the
might have been the Bais Yosef. Right. But the Bais Yosef did have a proficiency in Kabbalah as well, so it's harder to understand that it's Bais Yosef. But one of them, and Arizal said, you don't have to beat yourself up. You don't have to have a chalisha sadas. This isn't the chiluk of your that your neshama was destined to become proficient in. Mm-hmm. Neurologically, we know today that even people with weaker intellectual ability, lower IQs, even people who have a hard time focusing, even if they have brilliant IQs, ADHD, diagnosed ADHD, when it comes to something that they're interested in, when it comes to something that excites them, neurologically, we see in the neurocircuitry that the dopamine which is the pursuit of pleasure, the pursuit of something that is desirable and enjoyable, begins to be activated. That allows for an increased focus, the equivalence of what other medication, what people may take like Adderall, to allow them to have a certain focus. When somebody has a gishmak in it, when it's what they're interested in, it affects their ability to concentrate, their ability to probe, to comprehend, and to ask things that really allow them to get to the MS. It's a famous ayam as well that we know that the Gemara gives such sophisticated logic and rationales for certain things like nigois, and who are the ones who are supposedly coming up with them. They are people who we might not expect such intellectual prowess from, whether it's a shivcha, whether it's other people. And the Hayamim essentially explains that when it's negea to you, I think it's from the name of the Rebbe Marash, when it's negea to you, when you're interested and passionate and invested in the outcome, it transforms or empowers the intellectual cognitive ability. And so chafetz, where you have that natural desire is so crucial. It's interesting that the fact that people don't naturally, I'll give you an example. I was once having a conversation with somebody who's a big Gabbai tzedakah, and he asked me a question that caught me off guard. He asked me, "What's your favorite tzedakah?" And I said, "Wow, Levi, I haven't thought of that. That's a fantastic question, and it's a little embarrassing that I don't have a favorite tzedakah yet." And I got back to him a couple of weeks later after thinking through the question. Somebody asks you off the street, off the bat, "What's your favorite chiluk of Torah?" What's your favorite Masachta? What's your favorite Rishon? What's your favorite Achar? If we don't have an answer, it's not because we don't have a favorite. It's because we don't necessarily associate Torah with the type of relatable experience that is supposed to engender a level of excitement the way we have that manifest in our other areas of life. Somebody asks you, what's your favorite food? You're going to have a response. What's your favorite place in the world that you vacationed in? What's your favorite car? What's your favorite activity or hobby? Skiing, surfing, biking. What's your favorite? We have those answers. So there's a certain kedusha that makes Torah seem less relatable. It's just one of those things that we do because we do. But in so doing, when we over sanctify it, we strip it away from the relatable quality that it's supposed to have, from the part of it that's supposed to be connected to our tchunas and nefesh. And lastly, I just want to say before we get into mental health, there's a vart from the Mekubalim. It's brought in different places in Kabbalah that when a person has an asayan in a certain area in life, it's usually because that was the main reason that their neshama came back into this world. It was to be misaken, to be mavar, to elevate that particular nisayan. So when you do have a certain set of nisyanis, instead of looking at it in such a frustrating way and say, why do I have to have this struggle? Nobody else has to, everybody else just effortlessly overcomes this taiva, this urge. This is a gift that is essentially a big red flag saying this is what you have to focus on. Others, they can focus on 1,000 things and they can go through life with a degree of uncertainty. Am I invested? Am I involved in the things that my neshama came to this world for? But those who have a certain asayan, they have a certain level of a GPS clarity to pinpoint where they have to focus on. With Torah, when you have that area in Torah, that you have a geshmakin, that's the same flag being held up to guide you. And more importantly, when you successfully master that chelik of Torah and your das, your perspective is indelibly intertwined with it, then it also might help your other chelik of what your neshama is here for, to inspire where to spend your kishreines, your talents, and your ability to make this world a better place. So these are all very important in honing and guiding and directing and narrowing what our tafkid is, both intellectually and how we learn Torah and how we connect to the Rebbeinu Shalom, and what does that mechayev us as far as our shluchas, what our intended mission is. So having this is so crucial to this to a degree of fulfillment, of degree of finding oneself.
So interesting. I just wanted to mention the connection to that because I found that a lot as growing up and going through a system and just, being, when you don't necessarily have the room to expand on your own, you could come across different kinds of box cutter, things that people implement upon you, whether this is because your chassidus implements upon your rebbe, your teacher, etc. Like there are different kinds of learning systems that people are part of, whether it's Daf Yomi, it's Rambam, on the daily thing that people are expected to learn for whatever reason, and they don't necessarily enjoy it. It could. I still can't figure this out because there's always an aspect of the Kabbalah Sayil that you need to some extent, but at the same time, when you're dealing with Torah, which is every person, every Yid, every Jew has a specific chelik that he's connected to in Torah, especially based on the Arizal. This is literally part of his tikkun for his neshama. It could be quite damaging, and from my experience as well, and many people, as they grow up, it really, if they're felt like they're forced into going areas that they don't necessarily want to, even though it's learning, it's a good thing, it really has a terrible effect on their psyche. And to some extent, it could be trauma. There's some form of trauma, not necessarily, the worst trauma, but there's some kind of like negative attitude that, it just pushes them away from it. And especially I've seen, there's a sefer called the Shevet Musar. It's written from, I think his name is Eliyahu Cohen, he's from Turkey. It's a city called Izmir in Turkey. It was about 300 or so years ago. He's a famous Bal Musar, quite controversial as well. He brings down this Arizal from the Sefer Gegulim, and he actually writes quite a sharp wording about this. He says you should not pay attention to the people who are trying to defy or trying to make fun of the chelik Torah that you decide to choose. And he describes, based on the reason why, and he says, if you put the two and two together, what's happening is if you pay attention to what they're saying, you take that into account. He says these people are going to end up forcing you to have to reincarnate your soul in another Gilgul, because you don't finish up your goals. And he takes it a step even further. He says you should know the Satan is mislavish on these people, but that's taking it. It's quite shyness that he's going into. Only a Bal Musar, could write like that. But I, if that's the point, I could definitely see how it could have an effect on the person's psyche, possibly even his mental health. When especially you're expected that this is supposed to be your life, this is supposed to be your energy, your moral compass, everything behind life. and you have this negative feeling towards it. Every time you have to study certain things that you don't enjoy. And that's part of the difficulty transitioning out of the yeshiva system, right? A lot of guys come out of the yeshiva system not enjoying what they experienced, and now they have to go into the real life and bring that into the real life. A lot of people don't end up doing that because of it,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. A lot of artists will say, for example, that they lost all enjoyment and passion for art once people started commissioning specific paintings that they had to go ahead and paint, as opposed to allowing them the freedom, the creative ability to really use their inspiration and channel that into artistry. Um, yeah, interestingly enough, people don't realize that some of the greatest Gedolim, even Litvish Gedolim, weren't into this cookie cutter, one size fits all. For example, the Steipler Gaon, if I'm not mistaken, the Steipler Gaon once complained to the Chazon Ish, which was his brother-in-law, that his son Chaim is not learning Lamdas and he's just going through Gemara Rashi Taisus. And the Chazon Ish told the Steipler, Lazim, don't worry, this suits him and you'll see. You'll see the proof will be in the pudding. And of course, he became one of the greatest Yaidei Torah in the last generation, Kol Torah Kula, Razlei Honestly. And so this sort of social level of expectations and the rigidity that it has the potential to turn people off, I don't think it has any source in Kedusha. I don't think it has any holy sources. And I think it's just a mechanism to keep everybody contained and doing the same thing, or maybe it comes from a level of laziness or a level of inability to have a school or yeshiva atmosphere where if everyone's doing their own thing. So at worst, it's coming from laziness. At best, it's coming from a lack of logistical, ability to manage that type of an individualized environment. But this doesn't have to be all or nothing. There could be certain starim that everybody is learning the same limud, but then having the ability, the freedom for a yeshiva student, for a bachar growing up, for a boy growing up, to know that there is the chilek of Torah that I can explore on my own and find a part of Torah that's enjoyable, and having that type of relationship encouraged, cultivated, and fostered, that is lacking. And that is something that's unfortunate because it takes away the organic sort of geschmack and relationship that somebody should have, that type of yachas to the Torah, as opposed to it being just something that's done.
Especially if you view it from the Arizal's perspective, this is part of his own evolution.
Yeah.
If a person doesn't get a chance throughout life because of his, he's being traumatized from yeshiva, to really even seek out which part he could connect to, he could go through his whole life, so to speak, not seeing light. I know that I've seen such lashonos that I've seen from Rebbe Rashab. Here's my mom discussing about Chassidus. The way he speaks very bluntly about people don't learn. Prim Sateri. He said people like that never see aren't zoiche. He says people who learn Prim Sateri, if they don't delve into it enough, he said these people, it's possible they will never see light in a lifetime. The same thing again, I believe, will apply in these areas, which the Torah is supposed to be our light, the light for all the nations. If we don't manage to tap into what connection we have with our personal tools, we won't be able to light that candle. And that's why more than ever, I think, maybe in this day, in this generation where we have access to so much information and there's so much mental issues in general. People have so many mental issues because of the overstimulation of everything. There's something they need to focus in on. They have to give themselves the opportunity to focus in on one thing, right, at a time, to give them that homey feeling, if you will. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Is that something that you've seen being suggested to people, dealing with mental health, that they do focus in, not necessarily from a Torah perspective even, but from a psychological perspective?
It's a specific angle of mental health. I think the mental health that I'm exposed to, that I'm dealing with, that we treat, has to do with big T trauma. It's people who are coming in who lack a certain existential sense of identity and validation and affirmation. You're talking about where Torah and the work that I do, where's the correlation? How does one help inform and guide the other? It's just very interesting that growing up with Yiddishkeit, we take certain principles for granted, and we heard them and we were taught them as such young children. And thankfully, they begin to subliminally sort of resonate and become a part of how we see the world.
Mhm.
And then when you look outside and you see people who don't have that exposure, don't have that chinuch, who weren't gifted the ability to have those principles in their lives, and what type of damage it can lead to. So, for example, just like a couple of basic ideas that we take for granted when we grow up in a firm environment, and that plays such an important role even on our wellness and our mental health and equilibrium. The fact that we have non-negotiable dignity, the fact that we are created in the Tzelem Elokim, and that there is a certain level of validation that we have that is existential and not dependent on people, places, or things, not dependent on what we do in life, but there's a certain foundational level of significance, importance that we have by virtue of the fact that we're born, that we're Yidden, that we have neshamas. That is something that can really provide an enormous reservoir of strength and resilience when people go through crises. They lose a job, they lose a relationship, they lose a family member, they lose some external monetary asset. And it has them really questioning themselves more than the pain of the loss. What am I worth? As Yidden, we don't have to question ourselves in that regard, because however painful life is, we know that there's a certain non-negotiable, unconditional level of affirmation and validation that existentially Hashem believes in us.
Mhm.
Another example would be tshuva, the ability to externalize an action and to recognize that there's a part of us that is pristine and is pure, and we could always go back to that place. And we don't have to define ourselves by our worst moments in life. Every saint has a past and every sinner has a future. These are basic ideas that when you don't have them and you do define yourself by every failure and you obsess over the failures, then we go back to the first point of existential validation, then you're left hanging. What is my life worth? And that could lead to suicidal ideation in such a quick way. So having, having these concepts and also going into pastures that don't have those concepts, don't have those principles, don't have those built-in sort of social sentiments that are created from Yadus. It's astonishing to see what a practical role they provide in basic mental health.
A good toolkit to have.
Yeah, so
Um,
many others as well, but those are just a couple of examples. Yeah,
um, sorry, we are running low on time,
yeah.
so I'm gonna ask one more question. I appreciate the time. One question just to finish off with. Maybe we could do a second run because there's so many things I would like to ask. But um, based on your experience, based on your personal desires and just observations, what would you like to see, if possible, to change in these areas that would help for all things you mentioned in the areas of Torah, in our communities, and beyond?
Okay, so I'll answer that in a nutshell, and it very much has to do with everything that we've been talking about. So it would almost seem like a continuation of the last few minutes of what we've been talking about. In a nutshell, I would love to see Torah more humanized. How? I'll give you an example, and there's so many other ways that this can get done. There's a certain lack of historical Messiah, an understanding of the context of the personalities of the people that are driving all these memories, whether it's in Chazal or it's Rishonim or it's Achronim. If I had the time, and Eretz Hashem one day I will, I would give a lecture series or a podcast dedicated to profiles, perspectives, and try and talk about, let's say, just Achronim, some of the Gedolei Achronim, and illustrate their story, their narrative, the circumstances that they were dealt with, the town that they lived in, the problems of their day, the choicest of their Torah, showing an underlying certain mahalach hamachshava. Obviously, not every Torah that every Achron said is going to have a unified thread. Torah is disparate. There's, Shisha Siddur Mavashnais, there's four Chalakim Shulchan Aruch. But there is a certain underlying mahalach, an intellectual methodology that the Gedolei Achronim have adapted or created in their own way. And last but not least, their hashkafa in Avodas Hashem, the type of messages that they were passionate about, and really see how all of those become interconnected. their story, their history, their Torah, their Hashkafa, and that just lends a certain degree of human relatability so that when we look at that Achron in the future, we'll never see anything he says in the same way. And more importantly, there's a basic reason why when you tell stories, people stay awake, right? The Gemara says Haggadah was taught Shabbos afternoon because it was a tough time for people to learn. Halacha less as much. How do we bridge the gap? When we inject a human flavor into the halacha because of the memra, because of the rishon, because of the achron, because of everything we know about that person, you are able to transport some of the milas and virtues of Haggadah and inject it in halacha. So this bringing a human relatability factor into Rishayim, into Achrayim, creates a whole nother level of relationship that engages us and stimulates us in a way that right now is lacking. So that's in a nutshell what I would love to see.
Fascinating. Because that is ultimately really the goal of what I'm trying to accomplish with this podcast. And I really appreciate, be able to do this right now with the time. Maybe there'll be a part two. If anybody wants to find, you do some work as well. You do certain, whether it's podcasts or shiurim online, if anyone wants to find you, where can they find you at?
We have a Spotify channel with all the BMH-based Medrash Hancock Park shiurim, hundreds of shiurim there in Halacha, in Chassidus, in Lamdus, and also on YouTube. I put out a very small 3-minute weekly Dvar Torah, which always has the same format. First minute or so is a story, and it's connected to the parsha. A little bite that if you didn't learn all week, chas v'shalom, and you want to come to the Shabbos table with something kurz and sharp to be able to share. So that's there as well. Pleasure to be here, and kol hakavod, continue in the really wonderful and holy work that you're doing.
Amazing. Thank you so much. All right.
Absolutely.